The jungle was still in the early morning darkness, the kind of darkness that seemed to breathe. Heavy mist clung to the ground in ghostly sheets, curling around the roots of giant trees and sliding between tall ferns like pale fingers. The air was cool but already thick, the promise of midday heat hiding somewhere above the canopy. Shadows sprawled across every surface, and even the birds, restless and sharp-tongued during most dawns, were silent. It was quiet in a way only battlefields could be quiet, full of things unheard but waiting. Corporal Samuel Price crouched beside a tree trunk as wide as a truck, one knee pressed into the wet soil, one calloused hand resting on the stock of his rifle. He had been awake since before first light, long enough for the morning moisture to seep through the knees of his fatigues and enough time for his nerves to work their way from tension into a steady hum. Price was used to nerves. Every man who fought in the Pacific learned to live with them, but today felt different. There was a tightness in his chest that wasn't fear and wasn't dread, though it had pieces of both. It was the feeling of being outnumbered beyond comprehension. He could hear the distant rumble of boots. He recognized the sound instantly. Japanese infantry, a lot of them. Price closed his eyes for a second and listened to the earth. It vibrated with the rhythm of men moving in coordinated formation. Hundreds, maybe more, maybe many more. He didn't need to count. All he needed to know was simple. A battalion-sized force was coming straight toward their hillside. His platoon had radioed the news up the chain hours ago. Reinforcements weren't coming in time. Their job was to slow the Japanese push long enough for the rest of the American line to reorganize. Except slow wasn't looking possible. Their platoon was down to 27 men. And Corporal Price only had one real weapon left. A weapon he built himself. Price turned toward the crude, hand-welded tube propped against the tree beside him, a mortar that looked more like junkyard scraps than military hardware. Its steel body was dented, scuffed, and covered in uneven weld lines. The firing base was a piece of scrap plate he had scavenged from an old Japanese truck the week before. Its elevation brace was made from a bent piece of pipe he had hammered straight against a rock. No manual, no standardized parts. Nothing from any quartermaster would have recognized this thing as a weapon. Yet it was, because Price made damn sure it was. He had worked on it for 3 evenings after patrols, hunched beneath a tarp while rain hammered the canopy overhead, using tools borrowed from a maintenance crew and metal scavenged from broken equipment. His squad mates had laughed at first. Hell, one of the sergeants had nearly ordered him to scrap the whole project. But Price kept building. He was stubborn and he was desperate. The Japanese had mortars everywhere. The Americans in this part of the jungle did not. So Price decided he'd make one. He tested it twice, small shells, low charges, carefully measured. It worked, barely, but it worked. Now he had 6 rounds left. 6 shells, 6 chances. And heading toward him were hundreds of Japanese troops armed with rifles, machine guns, knee mortars and grenades. An entire battalion moving to crush the thin American line. Private Lance Harper crouched beside Price, wiping sweat from his brow even though the sun hadn't broken the horizon yet. "You hear them too, Corporal?" Price nodded. "Yeah. How many you figure?" "A lot," Price said. "That's a real scientific number," Harper muttered. "So gonna love that in the report." Price didn't reply. His focus was on the fog rolling between the trees, lit faintly by the widening glow of dawn. Somewhere out there, maybe 200 yards down the slope, the Japanese were moving in fast. Their boots, their whispered commands, the occasional metallic clack of gear, it all faded together into a grim chorus. The Americans had dug in along a ridge, using natural rock outcroppings and fallen logs as cover. They had no heavy support weapons left. Their machine gun team was down to 1 functioning barrel, overheated from last night's firefight. Their ammo was low. Their medic had only a handful of sulfur packets and bandages left. They had no artillery, no tanks, no air support. Just rifles, and one homemade mortar. Harper's voice dropped lower. Price, I know you believe in that thing, but you really think it's gonna stop that many? Price adjusted the elevation brace on the mortar. No. Harper blinked. No. No mortar stops a battalion, but it can break their momentum. 6 shells though, Harper whispered. That's 6 bangs, then what? We use those bangs right, Price said quietly, and 6 is all we need. Harper swallowed. You really believe that? Price didn't look at him. He tightened a wing nut on the firing plate, adjusting the angle by feel alone. Belief doesn't matter. What matters is I built it, I know it works, and I'm damn sure gonna try. A twig snapped, sharp, close. Price froze. Harper ducked, gripping his rifle. The jungle breathed again. More footsteps, more movement. The rumble of the enemy coming closer, tightening the noose around the American position. From the left flank, Sergeant Branson hissed, Price, you ready? Price stood up, wiping mud from his hand onto his fatigues. Ready as I'll ever be. Branson crouched behind a fallen tree. His face was smeared with dirt and sweat. His uniform was torn at the shoulder where a bullet had ripped through it last night. He stared at the makeshift mortar as if still unsure it should even exist. You sure that thing's not gonna blow us up? Price shrugged, 50-50. Branson grunted, comforting. More footsteps echoed through the ravine below. The Japanese were spreading out now. Price could hear their officers giving quiet orders. He recognized the cadence. They were preparing a coordinated assault. Branson looked out toward the fog. They'll be on us in 5 minutes, maybe less. Price nodded. Then we fire before they know we are here. Branson licked his lips. All right, you're our only indirect fire, make it count. Price knelt again and pulled the first American 16 shell from the canvas satchel beside him. Each shell looked too clean for the mud, too bright, too hopeful. They were the last of what the platoon had, 6 of them, 6 rounds that would define how many of them were alive by noon. He held the shell firmly in his hand, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness of the metal, the small imperfections in the paint. He tapped the fuse lightly with his thumb. Harper whispered, how you gonna aim without sights? Price looked up, sound memory, the way the ground slopes. Memory, Harper hissed. Price, you've fired this thing 2 times. Good enough. Price stood, adjusted the mortar's angle by a few degrees, and listened carefully. The first wave of Japanese troops had reached the lower slope. He could hear their boots hitting roots and rocks. He could hear the brush shifting as they spread into attack formation. He heard their NCOs begin to whisper commands. Branson ducked lower, Price any time. Price exhaled, firing. He dropped the first shell down the tube. It clanked once, twice. Then, whump. The mortar spat fire and smoke as the shell shot upward, disappearing into the fog. For a moment, the jungle held its breath. Then the explosion hit. A deafening crack echoed through the ravine, followed by screams and the chaotic thud of bodies hitting the ground. A blast of air shook the leaves above Price's head. The fog glowed orange for a moment, then darkened again. Harper blinked. Where did it land? Price didn't answer. He was already prepping the next round. The explosion told him everything he needed to know. It hit close, very close. The Japanese formation faltered briefly. Then more boots thundered forward. The enemy wasn't stopping, they were adjusting. Branson shouted from behind his log, Price, hit him again. Price lifted the second shell, need 3 more seconds. He counted under his breath. He tilted the mortar slightly, adjusting for the slope. Dropped the shell. Whump. The second explosion came even closer to the main body of Japanese infantry. More screams, more shouts. The jungle canopy shook with the force. Harper's voice broke. "You're hitting dead center." Price wiped sweat from his brow. Not dead center yet. The Japanese line slowed. But it didn't break. More boots, more shouting. Price heard an officer yelling commands. The enemy was spreading out, trying to flank the ridge. They were quick, disciplined, determined. Branson yelled, "They're regrouping." Price grabbed the third shell. Good. He adjusted aim again. 2 degrees left, 1 degree higher. Dropped the shell. Whump. The third explosion ripped through the right side of the Japanese formation. He could hear gear flying, rifles clattering, men hitting the ground. For the first time he heard panic in the Japanese voices. Their assault rhythm faltered. Harper stared at him. "Price, they're slowing down, it's working." Price didn't smile, he didn't relax, he didn't even look at Harper. He grabbed the fourth shell. His voice calm, 2 more. He listened to the rustle of movement below. He listened to the stagger in the enemy's formation. He listened to the gap he was carving into their attack. He adjusted aim by instinct, a tiny shift like tuning an instrument. Dropped shell 4. Whump. This explosion was devastating. Price felt it in his ribs. Trees swayed, a shockwave rolled across the ridge. Japanese soldiers screamed, scattering away from the blast zone. The attack was no longer coordinated, it was turning chaotic. Branson shouted through the roar, "Price, you just broke their left flank." Price finally let out a breath. Harper shook his head in disbelief. "Corporal, they're actually pulling back." "No," Price said quietly. "They're hesitating, there's a difference." The Japanese regrouped again, but it wasn't the same. The timing of their movement was off, their spacing uneven. Their officers shouted louder, more frantic. Price reached into the bag. Only 2 shells left. He held the 5th shell in his hand. Harper whispered, "Price, they're afraid of you." Price closed his fingers around the shell. Good. He raised it, and the jungle erupted again. As the Japanese made their final push, the jungle shifted again, not slowly, not cautiously, this time with desperation. Price could hear the difference immediately. The Japanese weren't advancing in steady, looming waves anymore. They were charging in uneven bursts, pushing their squads forward as fast as they could to overwhelm the ridge before the improvised mortar tore them apart completely. Harper ducked low as a burst of Japanese rifle fire cut through the bushes near his head. Leaves exploded into shreds, drifting downward like tiny green snowflakes. "They're rushing," he shouted. Price didn't need the warning. He could feel the tempo change. The entire forest seemed to tilt forward as the Japanese battalion hurled itself up the hillside. Their officers were screaming orders, desperately trying to pull their formation back together before the American mortar fire finished breaking it. Branson yelled across the ridge, "Hold the line, hold fire, fire." The American rifles cracked back in reply. M1 Garands barked, bars chattered. A single Thompson burst cut through the noise like a buzz saw. The ridge lit up with muzzle flashes, their bright stabs of orange carving holes through the thinning fog. But the Japanese kept coming. They surged between tree trunks, crawled under hanging vines, sprinted across exposed gaps, their silhouettes weaving in and out of the drifting mist. Price had seen Japanese charges before, but never one this determined, this frantic. They were throwing themselves into the fight with the kind of desperate courage that came only when their commanders sensed a single weakness that had to be crushed immediately. Price had one more weakness to exploit. He lifted the 5th shell. Harper saw his hands shaking and whispered, "Price, take your time." "I don't have time," Price murmured. He adjusted the mortar's angle just a hair lower than before. He didn't have to see the enemy to know where they were. He could hear them. The jungle was carrying the sounds perfectly now, the stomping of boots, the snapping of branches, the wet slap of mud as bodies pushed uphill. They were too close. If they reached the ridge, the mortar would be useless. This had to be the shot that broke them. He inhaled once, dropped the fifth shell. Whump! The round rocketed into the sky, disappearing above the canopy before curving back downward toward the heart of the approaching battalion. The explosion hit like a thunderclap. It wasn't a normal blast. It wasn't a small detonation. It was the kind of impact that seemed to shove the air itself outward in a violent ripple. Trees near the blast bent inward from the shock. A cloud of dirt, leaves, and debris erupted upward in a massive plume. Price felt the ground tremble beneath his knees. Harper gasped, "Holy Price, you hit right in the middle." "He did." Screams and chaos filled the ravine. Japanese soldiers dove to the sides, ducking behind rocks, rolling into vegetation, breaking formation completely. Their charge collapsed into a scatter of bodies as the explosion tore apart the front ranks. Branson yelled, "They're falling back, hit 'em now." American rifle fire intensified instantly. A hail of bullets tore through the wavering Japanese line. Men dropped across the slopes. Those still standing hesitated, unsure whether to push forward or retreat. Price had one shell left. One. He reached into the satchel and closed his hand around the final round. The last one. The metal felt heavier than the others, as if it knew what it meant. The weight of the entire ridge seemed to settle into Price's palm. If this shot failed, the Japanese would regroup, reorganize, and rush again. They were wounded but not defeated. One battalion could sustain casualties that would devastate an American platoon. Price's hand trembled, not with fear but with the realization of finality. Harper saw the tremor. "Hey, you built it, you trust it, I trust it." Price nodded once. He raised the sixth shell. Below, the Japanese regrouped again. Their officers shouted commands, rallying their shaken troops. They were fast, brutally fast, pulling survivors into new formations, pushing reinforcements from the rear to the front. Their discipline was terrifying to watch. Even after taking 5 direct mortar hits, even after losing dozens, maybe more, they were preparing another charge. Somewhere out of sight, a Japanese bugle blasted a sharp, urgent note. Harper's eyes widened. "Price, they're charging again." Price inhaled slowly, deeply, the kind of breath a man takes before stepping into his fate. He adjusted the mortar, tiny movements guided by instinct and sound. He listened to the footsteps thundering together, to the officers' voices rising, to the brush shaking violently, to the breath of the jungle itself. Then he dropped the final shell. The mortar fired. The recoil jolted the ground beneath him. Harper leaned forward, eyes wide, searching through the fog for the impact. 2 seconds passed. 3, 4. Then the explosion came. A single, massive detonation echoed like a cannon blast across the hillside. The orange fireball tore through the jungle, ripping apart trees, blasting apart roots, sending bodies tumbling through the air. The explosion was perfectly placed, dead center of the reorganizing Japanese formation. The charge stopped instantly. The sound of boots halted. The shouting ceased. The forest fell into a stunned silence. Branson peeked over his log and blinked. "Sweet mother of Price, you just wiped out their whole damn middle." He did. The Japanese battalion didn't just pause, they froze, stunned by the violence of the sixth impact. Their officers shouted desperately, trying to rally the shattered force, but this time the troops didn't move forward. They weren't regrouping, they were recoiling. For the first time, Price heard fear in their voices. The fear wasn't of the Americans. It was of him. His mortar. His impossible shots. His homemade weapon that shouldn't have worked and yet had just halted an entire battalion in its tracks. Branson pointed. Price, look. The Japanese were retreating. Not in a chaotic rout, not in blind panic. They were pulling back quickly and strategically, dragging their wounded, leaving behind shattered weapons and spent casings. Their officers shouted at them to stop, but they didn't. The battalion had broken. The entire assault had collapsed. Harper stood up slowly. Price, they're actually falling back. The whole battalion, they're done. Price didn't move. He stared down the slope, breathing hard, sweat dripping from his forehead, his hands still clutched around the smoking mortar tube. He didn't feel triumph or relief, only exhaustion so deep it felt carved into his bones. Branson approached him slowly. Corporal Price, you just saved this entire ridge. Price let out a long breath. We all did. Mortar was just part of it. No, Branson said, that wasn't just part of it. That was the whole damn reason we're all still breathing. Harper laughed weakly. And to think, they laughed at you when you built that thing. Branson added, yeah, Japanese laughed too, until you dropped 6 shells on their heads and sent them running. Price wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. The jungle around him was filled with smoke, the faint scent of burning leaves drifting through the air. The echoes of the last explosion hung in the canopy like a fading ghost. Harper crouched beside him. You okay? Price nodded. Yeah, but we're not done. Branson frowned. They're retreating. What more? They'll send another unit, Price said. Reinforcements, they'll regroup. We stopped 1 battalion, but the line isn't safe yet. Branson sighed. Price, we bought hours with what you did, maybe the whole day. Price slowly lowered his homemade mortar to the ground. The steel tube was scorching hot, warped slightly from the repeated blasts, but miraculously intact. Harper stared at it. Can you fix it? No, Price said. It's done. That was its last shot. Branson nodded. Hell of a way to retire a weapon. Price gave a tired, faint smile. Down the slope, the Japanese battalion's retreating shapes vanished between the trees. Harper whispered, they'll tell stories about you. No, Price said, they'll tell stories about us. Branson clapped him on the shoulder. One thing's for damn sure, word about this is gonna spread fast. Price finally stood. He looked at the battlefield he had shattered with 6 homemade shells. He looked at his exhausted platoon, alive because of it. And he knew this would not be forgotten. The smoke from the final blast drifted slowly across the ridge, curling into the branches above like drifting spirits. The jungle seemed to exhale after the violence, its stillness returning not naturally but cautiously, as if waiting to see whether the battle truly ended or whether the Americans would be swallowed next. Price remained still, listening to the last echoes disappear into the canopy. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, loaded with the memory of chaos. The entire platoon stayed low for several seconds more, rifles pointed downhill, breaths held, ears tuned to the slightest sound. No one dared move until they were certain the Japanese weren't regrouping for another charge. Finally, Sergeant Branson stood, eyes scanning the slope. His voice was low, almost reverent. They're gone, Price, you did it. Harper rose slowly, still gripping his rifle. Never seen anything like that. 1 homemade mortar stopping a whole battalion. It's not about the mortar, Price said quietly. Harper raised a brow. Come on, man, 6 shots, 6 direct hits. It was timing, Price interrupted. They were bunched up, caught in the terrain, in the fog. If they'd been wider spread, we'd be dead right now. Branson smirked. That humility is real nice, Corporal, but let's be honest, what you just pulled off was impossible. Price didn't argue. He wasn't sure himself how each shot had landed as precisely as it had. He had fired the mortar on sound alone, trusting instincts sharpened by weeks in the jungle and the strange mechanic's intuition he had always possessed. Some men had a natural gift for shooting rifles, others for reading maps. Price's gift was understanding angles and trajectories. But this morning had been something else. Harper kicked a spent rifle casing. What now? Now we check for wounded, Branson said, motioning toward squad leaders. And get ready, they'll be back sooner or later. The platoon moved cautiously through their defensive line, stepping over roots and ducking beneath hanging vines. A couple of men were bruised from near misses. One soldier nursed a graze from a Japanese round that had sliced through his sleeve. Miraculously, despite being overwhelmed hours ago and under-equipped, they had suffered no fatalities in the morning assault. Price slung his rifle over his shoulder and made his way down the ridge, feet sliding over damp soil. As he approached the tree line, he stopped at the crater where the 6th shell had landed. It was massive, twice the size of the others. The explosion had uprooted a tree thicker than Price's torso, tossing it sideways like a matchstick. The ground was torn open in jagged spirals of earth. Branches and foliage hung in tatters like shredded cloth. Pieces of fragmented metal, rifle barrels, shattered helmets, bent bayonets were scattered across the crater and its edges. Price swallowed slowly. That was bigger than expected. Harper came up behind him. You're telling me, next time you build something, remind me not to stand anywhere near the blast zone. Price kneeled and lifted a twisted piece of shrapnel. He recognized it, the stabilizer fin of the 6th shell. The fin was almost melted from the heat. That meant the explosion had reached temperatures higher than his first 2 test shots. He ran his thumb across the jagged edge. Harper crouched beside him. You thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah, Price said. Powder load was unstable. Harper frowned, meaning I probably shouldn't have lived through firing that shot. Harper stared at him. Hell of a time to figure that out. Branson called down from the ridge. Price, get up here. Price dropped the fin and jogged back up the slope. Branson pointed into the jungle beyond the crater field. Movement to the east. Harper lifted his rifle. Another battalion. No, Branson said. Small group, maybe 5 or 6. Price squinted through the haze. Figures emerged, slow, cautious shapes, American helmets, rifles held low, a patrol. Lieutenant Hardwick appeared moments later, stepping over a fallen tree, his uniform soaked in mud from the early morning march. He looked exhausted but alert. His eyes roamed over the ridge and the scattered aftermath of the fight. What the hell happened up here? Hardwick asked. Branson pointed to Price. Ask him. Hardwick looked Price over, then the mortar tube on the ground, warped and smoking. That thing yours? Price nodded. You fire it? Yes, sir. Hardwick glanced downhill. 6 craters, 6. Price nodded again. Hardwick stared at him for a long moment. Corporal, did you stop the entire assault yourself? No, Price said quickly. We all did. Branson snorted. He means you started it. We just rode the wave. Harper added, he broke them, sir. All 6 shots hit, every one. Hardwick stepped to the ridge, surveying the destruction below. He shook his head slowly. I've seen artillery barrages that didn't do this much damage. He turned back to Price. How in God's name did you hit each shot blind? Sound, Price said, and angle. Hardwick's brow furrowed, angle. Yes, sir. Hardwick stared a moment longer, then exhaled. Well, hell, whatever it was, you saved the line. Command needs to hear about this. Price lowered his head. Praise made him uncomfortable. He built things, he fixed things. He wasn't built to take credit for them. Hardwick waved for everyone to gather. Listen up, I've got orders. The platoon circled around. Hardwick continued. Higher command says Japanese reinforcements are pushing from the north. We need to move positions and establish a new defensive line. We hold here for another hour, then fall back. Branson asked, we expecting another attack? Hardwick nodded, highly likely. Battalion scouts spotted movement along the ridge 3 clicks out. Harper sighed, great, more fun. Hardwick pulled out a map. We need a second position already prepared before they regroup. Corporal Price on me. Price followed him a few steps away from the others. You good? Hardwick asked. Yes, sir. Can you still fight? Yes, sir. Hardwick nodded. I'm putting you in charge of a recon pair. Take Harper with you, scout the slope to the south. We need to know if the Japanese are circling. Price nodded again, understood. Harper jogged over, scout us. Yep, Price said, slinging his rifle. They disappeared down a narrow deer trail leading deeper into the jungle. The canopy closed above them, dimming the already muted light. Fog pooled between the trees and the ground squished beneath their boots. Harper whispered, feels like walking through a graveyard. Price didn't respond, he listened. They moved quietly, slow, deliberate steps. Harper's ears picked up distant rustles, but Price was listening for something different. Footsteps had patterns. Patterns revealed direction, speed, numbers. Every sound told a story. At 200 yards out, they found signs. Broken branches, fresh footprints, disturbed leaves. Harper crouched beside a print, boots Japanese. A small group, Price said, maybe 6 or 7. Scouts? Probably. Harper frowned. You think they heard your mortar? Everyone heard the mortar. They pushed deeper until they reached a small clearing. Price lifted a fist, halt signal. Harper froze. A voice is low, whispered. A Japanese. 7 soldiers crouched near a rock formation, scanning maps, repositioning their gear. An officer pointed toward the ridge right at the Americans' position. Harper leaned close. Price, they're planning a flank. Price nodded slowly. Then something caught his eye. One of the Japanese soldiers held binoculars, looking directly at the ridge they had just defended. Harper whispered, we take them out. No, Price said, we follow them. Harper blinked. Follow, Price, they'll lead us straight into another unit. I know. Then why? Price's voice stayed calm. Because if they flank us successfully, our whole platoon dies. We need to know where they're going. Harper exhaled. You're something else, you know that. Price said nothing. The Japanese scouts moved deeper into the jungle, heading southeast. Price followed, quiet, methodical, without hesitation. Harper swallowed hard and followed his lead. The 2 American soldiers moved like shadows. Birds returned, chirping softly overhead. The jungle carried the smell of wet soil. Everything was calm, until gunfire cracked behind them. Harper spun, that's our ridge. Price's face hardened, they're hitting us again. Harper gripped his rifle, we go back. Price shook his head slowly, not yet. Not yet, Price, that's our guys. I know, Price said, But if we go back blind and they flank from two sides, we lose everyone. Harper froze. Price wasn't choosing to abandon the ridge. He was choosing to protect it. Harper nodded slowly. Okay, laid on. They crept forward again. The Japanese scouts moved toward a ravine. Price and Harper followed at a distance until the sound of rushing water filled the air. The ravine opened ahead, revealing an outpost, camouflage nets, ammo crates, a dozen more Japanese soldiers preparing to move. Harper's eyes widened. They're regrouping, a second force. Price pointed, and they're about to hit us from behind. Harper whispered, "What do we do?" Price looked at the ravine walls, the water, the rocks. Thinking. Price whispered, "We don't have a mortar." Harper nodded grimly, "Yes." Price tilted his head, "But they do." Harper blinked, "Wait, what?" Price pointed to the Japanese outpost. Stacks of knee mortar rounds, positioned in 8 rows. Harper swallowed. "Price, what are you thinking?" Price didn't smile, but his eyes sharpened. "We are going to use their own shells against them."